G'day, it's Paul. I want to tell you a story that touched my life when I was a boy. I got this book given to me called The Miricale on the River Kwai, and it's stuck with me for 50 years. It's in the jungles of Thailand, 1943, Second World War, and there's a whole bunch of prisoners of war there, Scots, Australians, English, and they're getting brutalised by the Japanese in the prison camp. So the prison camp at Kwai, it sinks to the lowest possible level, and the men are living like dogs. It's dog eat dog, and every man for himself, and every day is hell. Men are dying of diseases, they're dying from overwork, and so it's a real mess. In the camp is a young Scotsman. He's lying in a hut. He was dying, but a couple of men, a Methodist and a Catholic, came and got him, built a little hut for him and nursed him back to health. And he'd been to university. He was a smart guy, he was a good soldier, but in his university days he became cynical about Christianity. He's left that behind, that religious stuff. Sort of was very unconvincing. He liked the sort of robust life of being a uni student and with the boys and that sort of thing, and thought that Christianity just didn't have answers that were any good for him. So in this prison camp he's lying there, and he starts to hear reports that things are changing. There's some examples of men who stood up for a mate, went outside the fence to get food for a mate and actually died in the process. Or one bloke who, when the work detail was being taken home, the Japanese guard said, "There's one of the shovels is missing." And they're saying, "Well, we've counted them." He said, "No, there's one missing. If you don't own up, I'll shoot you." And ends up one of the boys stood forward and he said, "I took it," and the guy beat him to death in front of the other soldiers. Well, when they got back to camp, they found all the shovels were there. This guy had actually sort of stood up for his mates. Well, that sort of example began to change people's attitudes. So Ernest Gordon's lying in his hut, and a shadow comes across the door. It's a chunky Australian sergeant from out of Cobar, not far from here, and he says, "You know, my mates and I have been looking around and thinking, what's going on here shouldn't happen. Like, we're living like dogs. There's got to be something better. I've got a New Testament here. I want you to help me understand, help us understand it." And he said, "I'm an atheist. I'm not a Christian. I'm not a preacher. I don't know anything much about religion." He said, "But you've been to university. You're a fighting man. Come on." So it's an amazing picture. Here's this atheist student, young bloke, with a bunch of hard-headed Aussies. This bloke was a miner from out of Cobar there. And they said, "We want to know whether this is the real dingo," was the expression they used. "We want to know whether this really cuts it in this kind of context, because we're living in hell here, and we want to know whether there's anything in this Jesus story or not." Well, as they began to read that story together and began to discover Jesus wasn't anything quite like what they'd heard in church or at Sunday school, he was actually a man like themselves, a working man. He had hard hands. He lived in a village. He was a carpenter. He understood people, and the way he talked to people and sort of embraced the outsiders, they thought, "This is fantastic. We didn't realise Jesus was like this." And he understands us here in this circumstance. He was shafted by friends and enemies. He got living rough. He knew how to live rough. And he loved the ordinary people. And they began to discover a Jesus that was like them, and so it began to transform the life in the camp. So all around the camp, men began to do things for one another. Like that sergeant, he organises a massage team to sort of help the blokes who'd lost use of their limbs. They began to invent artificial limbs. They began to write music, and run concerts. Started a little university, and all around them hell is still going on. It didn't stop. And they call it, that's why he called it the Miricale on the River Kwai, because here are these men without any sort of church support. There was a few chaplains, but then they're living in absolute hell. And if you want to put the acid test on whether the Jesus story works, well, that's got to be the most amazing test. For me, for 50 years, I've read that story and passed it on to many other people. And what can you say about it? Can you say, "Oh yeah, they're a bunch of wankers, so what would they know?" Or you've got to say, wow, that is the real test, that's the real thing. as the Australian said, it was the real dingo that discovered Jesus was the real dingo. You know, by the end of the war, as they've been trucked out, Japanese train comes in this way, full of wounded, and the prisoners of war, they're looking out and they see these Japanese wounded in their train, just left there to die because they didn't really look after their wounded. They said, well, if you got shot, that's your bad luck and your karma. Some of these prisoners whose lives have been changed, even though they've been brutalised by the Japanese, get out of their train, go across to the Japanese wounded, start to give them a drink of water and a little bit of kindness and generosity. How amazing is that? When I think of that picture, I get tears in my eyes thinking, but people who say to me, you know, the Jesus thing, you know, that's a lot of rubbish, happened a long time ago. No, it's not. It's the real thing. It is the real dingo, and it does change people's lives. And when I read that story, when I give that story to people, I say, well, you work it out for yourself. Is this the real thing or not? I'm Paul Rowe, and I'm the Outback Historian.